Story 20. Contention of Sa'adi with a disputant concerning wealth and poverty. I saw a man in the form, but not with the character of a dervish, sitting in an assembly, who had begun a quarrel, and having opened the record of complaints, reviled wealthy men, alleging at last that the head of power, the hand of power of dervishes to do good, was tied, and that the foot of the intention of wealthy men to do good was broken. Well, rich or poor, we all have our opportunity, and the judgment based on what some of the case is. The liberal have no money. The wealthy have no liberality. And we don't mean the political liberal thing either, and we don't mean the liberal as in liberal with beliefs and practices. I mean, but liberal as in free acting. I, who had been cherished by the wealth of great men, considered these words offensive and said, "My good friend, the rich are the income of the destitute, and the hoarded store of recluses, the objects of pilgrims, the refuge of travelers, the bearers of heavy loads, for the relief of others. They give repasts and partake of them to feed their dependents and servants, their surplus of their liberalities being extended to widows, aged persons, relatives, and neighbors. The rich must spend for pious uses, vows and hospitality, tithes, offerings, manumissions, gifts, and sacrifices. How canst thou attain their power of doing good, who art able to perform only the prayer afflictions, and these with 100 distractions?" And when you do your rituals, the issues with that fade away via the rest of your life. And likewise, it helps you perform the rest of your life. But tithes might be better translated as obligatory alms if we're referring to something like zakat, or and sadaqah being the just any charity. Because I don't think that a tenth is the sort of thing being talked about in any of that. If there be efficacy in the power to be liberal and in the ability of performing religious duties, the rich can attain it better because they possess money to give alms. Their garments are pure. Their reputation is guarded. Their hearts are at leisure. Inasmuch as the power of obedience depends upon nice morsels and correct worship upon eloquent clothes, it is evident that the hungry bowels have but little strength, and empty hand can afford no liberality. Shackled feet cannot walk, and no good can come from a hungry belly. He sleeps troubled in the night, who has no support for the morrow. The ant collects in summer a subsistence for spending the winter in ease. Freedom from care and destitution are not joined together, and comfort and poverty is an impossibility. A man who is rich is engaged in his evening devotions, whilst another who is poor is looking for his evening meal. How can they resemble each other? He who possesses means is engaged in worship. Whose means are scattered, his heart is distracted. The worship of those who are comfortable is more likely to meet with acceptance, their minds being more attentive and not distracted or scattered. Having a secure income, and may attain to devotion. The Arab says, "I take refuge with Allah against base poverty and neighbors whom I do not love." There is also a tradition, poverty is the blackness of face in both worlds. He retorted by asking me whether I had heard the Prophet saying, "Poverty is my glory." I replied, "Hush, the Prince of the world alluded to the poverty of warriors in the battlefield of acquiescence and of submission to the arrow of destiny, not to those who don the patched garbs of righteousness, but sell the doles of food given them as alms. So poverty is in not being attached to the worldly things, not whether or not you have them. O drum of high sound and nothing within, what wilt thou do without means when the struggle comes? Turn away the face of greed from people if thou art a man. Trust not the rosary of 1,000 beads in thy hand. A dervish without divine knowledge rests, not until his poverty culminates in unbelief. For poverty is almost infidelity, because a nude person cannot be clothed without money, nor a prisoner liberated. How can the like of us attain their high position? And how does the bestowing resemble the receiving hand? Knowest thou not that God the Most High and Glorious mentions in his revealed word, the pleasures of paradise? They shall have a certain provision in paradise to inform thee that those who are occupied with cares for subsistence are excluded from the felicity of piety, and that the realm of leisure is under the ring of certain provision. Now, see, that's what they mean too, that free to do stuff. And that means free from what you have too, rather than free to, free as in, well, know what belief and action they're going to let loose on, right? The thirsty look in their sleep on the whole world as a spring of water. Wherever thou beholdest one who has experienced destitution and tasted bitterness, throwing himself wickedly into fearful adventures, and not avoiding their consequences, he fears not the punishment of Yazid, and does not discriminate between what is licit or illicit. The dog whose head is touched by a clod of earth leaps for joy, imagining it to be a bone. And when two men take a corpse on their shoulders, a greedy fellow supposes it to be a table with food. But the possessor of wealth is regarded with a favorable eye by the Almighty for the lawful acts he has done and preserved from the unlawful acts he might commit. Although I have not fully explained this matter, nor adduced arguments, I rely on thy sense of justice to tell me whether thou hast ever seen a mendicant with his hands tied up to his shoulders, or a poor fellow sitting in prison, or a veil of innocence rent, or a guilty hand amputated, except in consequence of poverty. Lion-hearted men were, on account of their necessities, captured in mines, which they had dug to rob houses, and their heels were perforated. It is also possible that a dervish, impelled by the cravings of his lust and unable to restrain it, may commit sin, because the stomach and the sexual organs are twins. That is to say, they are the two children of one belly, and as long as one of these is contented, the other will likewise be satisfied. I heard that a dervish had been seen committing a wicked act with the youth, and stoned. Oh, and put to shame. And although he had been put to shame, he was also in danger of being stoned. He said, "O Muslimin, I have no power to marry a wife, and no patience to restrain myself. What am I to do? There's no monasticism in Islam." Well, that's misusing what in Surah 58. Among the number of causes producing internal tranquility and comfort in wealthy people, the fact may be reckoned that they take every night a sweetheart in their arms, and may every day contemplate a youth whose brightness excels that of the shining morn, and causes the feet of walking cypresses to conceal themselves abashed, plunging the fist into the blood of beloved persons, dyeing the fingertips with the color of the jujube fruit. It is impossible that with his beauteous stature he should prowl around prohibited things or entertain intentions of ruin to himself. How could he who took as booty a hurry of paradise take any notice of the Venice of Yagma, who has before him fresh dates, which he loves, has no need to throw stones on clusters upon trees. Mostly empty-handed persons pollute the skirt of modesty by transgression, and those who are hungry steal bread. When a ferocious dog has found meat, he acts not whether it is of the camel of Saleh or of the donkey of Dujal. What a number of modest women have, on account of poverty, fallen into complete profligacy, throwing away the precious reputation to the wind of dishonor. With hunger, the power of abstinence cannot abide. Poverty snatches the reins from the hands of piety. Whilst I was uttering these words, the dervish lost the bridle of patience from his hands, drew forth the sword of his tongue, caused the steed of eloquence to caper in the plain of reproach, and said, "Thou hast been so profuse in this panegyric of wealthy men, and hast talked so much nonsense, that they might be supposed to be the antidote to poverty, or the key to the storehouse of provisions." Well, Surah 56 is an antidote to suffering from poverty. And some people, it enables them to not be poor, but suffering from poverty is not the same thing as being poor. Whereas they are a handful of proud, arrogant, conceited, and abominable fellows, intent upon accumulating property and money, and so thirsting for dignity and abundance, that they do not speak to poor people except with insolence and look upon them with contempt. They consider scholars to be mendicants and insult poor men on account of the wealth which they themselves possess and the glory of dignity which they imagine is inherent in them. They sit in the highest places and believe they are better than anyone else. They never show kindness to anybody and are ignorant of the maxim of sages that he who is inferior to others in piety but superior in riches is outwardly powerful, but in reality a destitute man. If a wretch on account of his wealth is proud to a sage, consider him to be the podex of a donkey, though he may be a perfumed ox. I said, do not think it allowable to insult them, for they are possessors of generosity. He rejoined, thou art mistaken. They are slaves of money. Of what use is it that they are like bulky clouds and rain not, like the fountain of light, the sun, and shine upon no one? They are mounted on the steed of ability, but do not use it. They would not stir a step for God's sake, nor spend one dirham without imposing obligation and insult. They accumulate property with difficulty, guard it with meanness, and abandon it with reluctance, according to the saying of illustrious men, and that the silver of an avaricious man will come up from the ground when he goes into the ground. One man gathers his wealth with trouble and labor, and if another comes, he takes it without either. I retorted, thou hast not become aware of the parsimony of wealthy men, except by reason of mendicancy, or else to him who has laid aside covetousness, a liberal and avaricious man, would appear to be the same. The touchstone knows what gold is, and the beggar knows him who is stingy. He rejoined, I am speaking from experience when I say that they station rude and insolent men at their gates to keep off worthy persons, to place violent hands upon men of piety and discretion, saying nobody is here, and verily they have spoken the truth. Of him who has no sense, intention, plan, or opinion, the gatekeeper has beautifully said, no one is in the house. I said, this is excusable because they are teased out of their lives by people expecting favors and driven to lamentation by petitions of mendicants. It is being, according to common sense, an impossibility to satisfy beggars, even if the sand of the desert were to be transmuted into pearls. The eye of greediness, the wealth of the world, can no more fill than dew can replenish a well. Hatem Tai dwelt in the desert, had been in a town, he would have been helpless against the assaults of beggars, and they would have torn to pieces his upper garments, as it is recorded in the Tayyibat. Look not at me, that others may not conceive hopes, because there is no reward to be got from beggars. He said, no, I take pity on their state. I replied, no, how envious them and their wealth. We were thus contending with each other. Every pawn he put forward, I endeavored to repeal. And every time he announced, check to my king, I covered him with my queen, until he had gambled away all his ready cash and had shot off all the arrows of his quiver in arguing. Now, one of the things about chess is that, yeah, people gamble with it, and people make graven images, but is chess in itself totally forbidden? No. And it's certainly not something an Islamic state would try to force people not to do. Have a care. Do not throw away the shield when attacked by an orator who has nothing except borrowed eloquence to show. Practice thou religion and marifet, because a Sujah speaking orator displays weapons at the gate, but no one is in the fort. At last, no arguments remained to him, and having been defeated, he commenced to speak nonsense, as is the custom of ignorant men who, when they can no more address proofs against their opponent, shake the chain of enmity, like the idol carver Azar, who, being unable to overcome his son, Abraham, in argument, began to quarrel with him, saying, if thou forbearest not, I will surely stone thee. The man insulted me. I spoke harshly to him. He tore my collar, and I cut hold of his chin case. He, falling upon me, and I on him, crowds running after us and laughing. The finger of astonishment of the world. Yeah. He falling upon me, and I on him, crowds running after us and laughing. The finger of astonishment of a world on the teeth from that was said and heard by us. In short, we carried our dispute, the Qazi, and agreed to abide by a just decision of the judge of the Muslimin, who would investigate the affair and tell the difference between the rich and the poor. When the Qazi had seen our state and heard our logic, he plunged his head into his collar, and after meditating for a while, spoke as follows. O thou who hast lauded the wealthy, and hast indulged in violent language towards dervishes, thou art to know that wherever a rose exists, there also thorns occur. That wine is followed by intoxication, that a treasure is guarded by a serpent, and that wherever royal pearls are found, men-devouring sharks must also be. The sting of death is the sequel of the delights of life, and the cunning demon bars the enjoyment of paradise. Now, people claim that religion takes the sting out of death. And, well, no, it points out that, death is only going to get worse if you haven't made proper regard of how you live your life. And you do preserve your life. So it's not that you go and you seek death because you found religion or some silly thing like that. Now, you may die as a result of doing the right thing, standing up for yourself or others, but what will the violence of a foe do if it cannot touch the seeker of the friend? Treasure, serpent, rose, thorn, grief, and pleasure are all linked together. Perceivest thou not that in a garden there are musk willows as well as withered sticks, and likewise in the crowd of the rich there are grateful and impious men, as also in the circle of dervishes some are forbearing and some are impatient. If every drop of dew were to become a pearl, the bazaar would be full of them as of donkey shells. Donkey shells. I'm sure they mean dung, right? Those near to the presence of the Most High and Glorious are rich men with the disposition of dervishes, and dervishes with the inclination of the rich. The greatest of rich men is he who sympathizes with dervishes, and the best of dervishes is he who looks but little towards rich men who trust in Allah. He will be his sufficient support. After this, the Qazi turned the face of reproof from me to the dervish and said, O thou who hast alleged that the wealthy are engaged in wickedness and intoxicated with pleasure, some certainly are of the kind thou hast described, but defected of aspirations and ungrateful for benefits received. Sometimes they accumulate and put by and eat and give not. If, for instance, the rain were to fail, or deluge were to distress the world, they, trusting in their own power, would not care for the misery of dervishes, would not fear God, and would say, if another perishes for want of food, I have some. What cares for a duck for the deluge? Well, it matters to the individual, right? The women riding on camels in their howdahs take no notice of him who sinks in the sauna. They base, when they have saved their own blankets, say, what boots it if all mankind perishes? There are people of the kind thou hast heard, and other persons who keep the table of beneficence spread out, the hand of liberality open, seeking a good name and pardon from God. They are possessors of this world and of the next, like the slaves of His Majesty, Padshah of the world, who is aided by divine grace, conqueror, possessor of authority among nations, defender of the frontiers of Islam, heir of the realm of Solomon, the most righteous of the kings of the period, Muzaffar, Dunya wa Uddin Atbek Abu Bakr bin Sa'ad bin Zanki. May Allah prolong his days and aid his banners. A father never shows the kindness to his son, which the hand of thy liberality has bestowed on mankind. God desired to vouchsafe a blessing to the world, and in his mercy made thee Padshah of the world. When the Qazi had thus far protracted his remarks and caused the horse of his eloquence to roam beyond the limits of our expectation, we submitted to his judicial decision, condoned to each other what had passed between us, took the path of reconciliation, placed our heads on each other's feet by way of apology, kissed each other's head and face, terminating the discussion with the following two distiches. Complain not of the turning of the spheres, O dervish, because thou wilt be luckless if thou diest in this frame of mind. O wealthy man, since thy heart and hand are successful, eat and be liberal, for thou hast conquered this world and the next. Well, one of the things about astrology, right, is that Astrology is what you make of it. So if you're just saying stuff about the stars and all that stuff, well, what concern does it do to you? You still have to live your life and whatever the circumstances are. And it turns out the more you know about those stars, the more you know that they really don't do all that stuff that people say. There are minute effects on gravity, and you can think about stuff and